if we look at George W. Bush, and maybe you can give me insights, this is what's fascinating to me. When you have extremely competent, smart, hardworking, well-intentioned people, how do we, as a system, make mistakes in foreign policy? So the big mistake you can characterize in different ways, but in George W. Bush is invading Iraq, or maybe how it was invaded, or maybe how the decision process was made to invade it. Again, Afghanistan, with maybe not the invasion, but details around like having a plan about, how to withdraw, all that kind of stuff. Then Barack Obama, to me, similarly, is a man who came to fame early on for being somebody who was against, a rare voice against the invasion of Iraq, which was actually a brave thing to do at that time. And nevertheless, I don't know the numbers, but I think he was the president for 8 years over increased drone attacks, everything from a foreign policy perspective, the military industrial complex, that machine grew in power under him, not shrunk, and did not withdraw from Afghanistan. And then with Donald Trump, the criticisms that you're presenting, sort of the personal attacks, the chaos, the partisanship of people that are supposed to be nonpartisan. So that, if you do sort of to steelman the chaos, to make the case for chaos, maybe we need to shake up the machine, throw a wrench into the engine, into the gears. And then every individual gear is going to be very upset with that, because it's the wrench. It's an inefficient process, but maybe it leads for government. It forces the system as a whole, not the individuals, but the system, to reconsider how things are done. So obviously all of those things, the actual results are not that impressive.
You could have done that on the latter, shaking things up, because I'm all one for questioning and trying to shake things up as well and do things differently.
Yes.
But, the question is, if you bring the whole system down with nothing, ideas of putting it into place. Look, I'm like many people, I've studied the Bolshevik Revolution and, many others as well. And, kind of what's the pattern here, that actually fits into what you're talking about here, is a kind of rigidity of thought on the part of revolutionaries in many cases as well. And also narcissism. In fact, I think it takes a pretty, strong sense of yourself, kind of an own yourself, to want to be president of the United States, for example. We see that in, many of our presidents have been narcissists to different, kind of degrees. You think about Lenin, for example, and people can go back and read about Lenin. He formed his views when he was about 18 and he never shook them off. He never evolved. He didn't have any kind of diversity of thought. And when systems go awry, it's when they don't bring in different perspectives. And so, Trump, if he brought in different perspectives and actually listened to them and not just, believe that he himself knew better than anyone else and then tried to divide everybody against each other, it would have been a different matter. It's a tragedy of a completely and utterly lost set of opportunities because of the flaws in his own nature. Because, again, there was all kinds of things that he could have done to shake things up. And so many people around him remained completely disappointed. And, of course, he divided and pitted people against each other, creating so much factionalism in American politics that, people have forgotten they're Americans. They think that they're red or blue, parts of teams. And, if you go back over history, that's a kind of a recipe for war and, internal conflict. You go back to, the Byzantine Empire, for example. There's the famous episode of the Nika riots in Constantinople, where the whole city gets trashed because the Greens, the Reds, the Blues, and these various sporting teams in the Hippodrome get whipped up by political forces, and they pull the place apart. And that's kind of where we've been heading on some of these trajectories. But the other point is, when you look back, at Bush and Obama as well, there's a very narrow circle of decision making. In Bush period, it's the focus on the executive branch, with Dick Cheney as the vice president being very fixated on it. In Obama, it's, he and, kind of the bright young things around him, from he himself is, kind of intellectually, one might say arrogant in many respects. He was a very smart guy and, he's convinced that he has, and he ruminates over a lot of things, but he's the person who makes, a lot of decisions. And basically George W. Bush used to call himself the decider as well, right? I mean, they're all the people who make the decisions. It's not always as consultative as you might think it is. And for Trump, it's like, I'm not listening to anybody at all. It's just me and whatever it is that I've woken up today and I've decided to do. So I think, the problem with all of our systems, why we don't get results, is because we don't draw upon, the diversity of opinion and all the ideas of, people out there. Like, you do that in science. I mean, all of my friends and relatives are in science. They've got these incredible collaborations with people, across the world. I mean, how did we get to these vaccines for the COVID virus? Because of this incredible years of collaboration and of, sharing results and sharing ideas. And our whole system has become ossified. We think about the congressional system, for example, as well. And there's, this kind of rapid, turnover that you have in Congress every 2 years. There's no incentive for people, basically to work with others. They're constantly campaigning. They're constantly trying to appeal to whatever their base is. And they don't really care about, some do, of their constituents, but a lot of people don't. And the Senate, it's all kind of focused on the game of legislation. For so many people as well, not focusing again on that kind of sense about what are we doing like scientists to kind of work together, for the good of the country to push things along. And also our government also is siloed. There's not a lot of mechanisms for bringing people together. There ought to be, and things like the National Security Council, the National Intelligence Council actually did that quite successfully at times for analysis that I saw. But we don't have, we have it within the National Institutes of Health, but we saw the CDC breakdown on this, kind of front. We don't have sufficient of those institutions that bring people together from all kinds of different backgrounds. And one of the other problems that we've had with government, with the federal government over state and local government, is it's actually quite small. People think that the federal government's huge because we've got postal service and the military that are part of it. But your actual federal government employees is a very small number. And, the senior executive service part of that is the older white guys, who kind of come up all the way over the last, several decades. We have a really hard time bringing in younger people into that kind of government service, unless they're political hacks, and they want to, or they're kind of looking for power and, sort of influence. We have a hard time getting people like yourself and other, younger people kind of coming in to make a career out of public service, and also retaining them, because, people with incredible skills often get poached away into the private sector. And, a lot of the people that I work with on the national security side are now at all kinds of, high-end political consultancies, or they've gone to Silicon Valley and they've gone to this place and that place. Because after a time as a younger person, they're not rising up particularly quickly, because there's a pretty rigid way of looking at the hierarchies and the promotion schemes. And they're also getting lambasted by everybody. People are like, public servants, they're not really public servants. There's this whole lack and loss of a kind of a faith in public service. And, the last few years have really done a lot of damage. We need to revitalize our government system to get better results. We need to bring more people in, even if it's, for a period of time, not just through expensive contracts for, the big consulting companies and, other entities that do government work out there, but getting, people in for a period of time, expanding some of these management fellowships and the White House fellows, and, bringing in, scientists, from the outside, giving, that kind of opportunity for collaboration that we see in other spheres.
I think that's actually one of the biggest roles for a president that, for some reason during the election, that's never talked about, is how good are you at hiring?
Yeah.
And creating a culture of like attracting the right, basically chief hirer. When you think of a CEO, like the great CEOs are, maybe people don't talk about it that often, but they do more often for CEOs than they do for presidents, is like, how good are you at building a team?
Well, we make it really difficult because of the political process. And also because we have so many political appointments, we ought to have less, to be honest. If we look at other governments around the world, that are smaller, it's much easier for them to hire people in.
Yeah.
Some of the most successful governments are much smaller. And it's not that I say that the government is necessarily too big, but it's just thinking about each unit in a different way. We shouldn't be having so many political appointments. We should kind of find more professional appointments, more non-partisan appointments, because, every single administration that we've had over the last, span of presidencies, they have jobs that are unfulfilled because they can't get their candidates through Congress and the Senate because of all the kind of political games that are being played. I know loads of people have just been held up because it's just on the whim of, some member of Congress, even though that the actual position that they want is really technical and doesn't really care about what political, preference they particularly have. So I think we have to try to look at the whole system of governance in the way that we would over, other professional sectors, and to try to think about this as, just as you said there, that this is a government that's actually running our country. This is an operating system, and you wouldn't operate it like that if you were, looking at it in any kind of rational way. It shouldn't be so ideologically or partisan tainted.
So you're
at every level anyway. So I would actually just say, make a bid for a more non-partisan approach to a lot of the parts of government. You can still kind of bring in, the political imprimatur, but also you have to explain to people writ large in America as well that this is your government. Yeah. And that actually you could also be part of this. Things like the Small Business Administration, the US Department of Agriculture, all these kind of things that actually people interact with, but they don't even know it. The Postal Service, all of these things. I mean, people actually, when you ask them about different functions of government, they have a lot of support for it. The National Park Service, for example, it's just when you talk about government in an abstract way, they're like, oh, no, too much, bloated, not efficient and effective. But if you kind of bring it down more to the kind of local and federal levels, that's kind of, when people really see it. And if people could see kind of themselves reflected in many of the people who've gone into public service, I think that they would have a lot more support for it.
More like superstars, like individuals that are like big on social media, big in the public eye, and having fun with it and showing cool stuff. That it's not, because right now a lot of people see government as basically partisan warfare, and then it makes it unpleasant to do the job. It makes it uninspiring for people looking in from outside about what's going on inside government, all of it, the whole thing. But you are, just with all due respect, you're a pretty rare individual in terms of nonpartisanship. Like just actually your whole life story, the humbling aspect of your upbringing and everything like that. Do you think it's possible to have a lot of nonpartisan experts in government? Like, can you be a top presidential advisor on Russia for 10 years, for 15 years, and remain nonpartisan?
I think you can. I don't think that's advisable, though, by the way, because I don't think anybody should be there.
So your first advice is to fire yourself after 10 years?
Well, you should definitely have term limits, just like you should in everything, right? I mean, it's just like tenure in universities.
Well, we all have kind of like term limits.
Yeah, you kind of, we do. We have natural term limits, but you're kind of, basically bottling it up for other people. I mean, what I'm trying to do now. I'm 57 now, and I always try to work with people from different generations to me, just like. I've really benefited from these, kind of mentorships of people older. You can, mentor up and mentor down. I mean, I would, try to get, people from different backgrounds and different generations to work together in teams. Honestly, I'd like to more team networked kind of approach to things, the kind of things that you get again in science, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, all these ideas are going to come from all kinds of different perspectives. Age and experience does count for something, but, fresh ideas and coming in and looking at a problem from a different perspective and seeing something that somebody else hasn't seen before. I mean, I just, kind of love working in an environment with all kinds of different people and people who don't agree with you. You need people to take you on and say, absolute, that's crap. Kind of, where did you come up with that from? And you go, hang on. Well, explain to me why you think so. And then, you have this kind of iterative process back and forth. I mean, I would always encourage my colleagues to tell me when they thought I was wrong. I mean, sometimes I didn't agree because I didn't see the reasoning, but other times I'd be like, they're right. That was a complete mistake. I need to admit that, and kind of we need to figure out a different way of doing things. But the one point I do want to get across is there were a lot of people who were non-partisan that I worked with. I mean, honestly, in most of the jobs that I had up until more recently, I had no idea about people's political affiliation. Mm. It's just when you get into this kind of highly charged partisan environment, they kind of force people, to make decisions. And when you have, one political party or political faction that's trying to usurp power, it does make it quite difficult. I mean, that's the situation that we're in right now. And, we're seeing some of the things happening in the United States I've seen and studied in other settings or seen for myself happening. When you have a president who wants to cling on to power, you've got to call that out. Is that a partisan act, or is that a kind of, defense of that larger political system that you're part of? So I think we've got to recognize that even if you're not partisan, you can be politically engaged. And, sometimes you just have to stand up there and speak out, which is, what I did and what others did as well. None of those people who spoke out, can initially saw that as a partisan act, even if some of them since then have decided to make political choices they hadn't made before, because the situation actually forced people into, taking sides. It's very hard to still stay above the fray when you've got, someone who's trying to perpetrate a coup.
Yeah, just to linger on that, I think it's hard and it's the courageous thing to do to criticize a president and not fall into partisanship after, because the whole world will assume if you criticize Donald Trump that you're clearly a Democrat, and so they will everybody will criticize you for being a Democrat, and then so you're now stuck in that, so you're going to just embrace that role. But to still walk the nonpartisan route after the criticism, that's the hard road. So not let the criticisms break you into, into a certain kind of ideological set of positions.
I mean, our political system needs revitalization. We need to be taking a long, hard look at ourselves here. And I think what people are calling out for, look, there's a vast swathe of the population like me who are unaffiliated. Maybe some lean in one direction over another, and unaffiliated doesn't mean you don't have views about things and political opinions, and you may sound quite extreme on some of those, either from a left or right perspective. But what people are looking for is a kind of an articulation, of things in a kind of a clear way that they can get a handle on, and they're also looking for a representation. Somebody's going to be there on, for you. Not part of a kind of a rigid team that you're excluded from. You're the ins and the outs. Look what people are looking at now. They're looking at that in the workplace because they're not finding that in politics. You're actually getting workers, pushing people talk about the rise of the worker, but people just saying, hang on a sec, the most important space that I'm in right now is my workplace, because that's where my benefits are from. They're not coming from the state. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a peculiarity of the United States system. In Britain, you've got the National Health Service and you've got all the kind of national-wide benefits. You're not tethered to your employer like you are in the United States. But here now, we're asking people, people are pushing for more representation. They're asking to be represented within their workplace, be it Starbucks, where baristas are, the Starbucks employees are trying to unionize. We have unions among our research assistants at the Brookings Institution where I am, kind of teaching assistants in big universities are doing the same kind of thing as well, because they want to have their voice heard. They want to kind of play a larger role and they want to have change. And they're often pushing their companies or the institutions they work for to make that change because they don't see it happening in the political sphere. Mm-hmm. So it's not just enough to go out there and protest in the street, but if you want something to happen, that's why you're seeing big corporations playing a bigger role as well.
Yeah, and of course, there's it's a longer discussion. There's also criticisms of that mechanisms of unions to achieve the giving of a voice to a people.
This goes back to my own experience growing up in Northern England. The Durham miners that I was part of for generations, first person in my family not in the mines on my dad's side, they created their own association. It wasn't a union per se at the very beginning. Later, they became part of the National Miners' Union. They lost their autonomy and independence as a result of that. But what they did was they pooled their resources. They set up their own parliament so they could all get together. Literally, they built a parliament. And it, opened in like the same time as World War I, and where they all got together because they didn't have the vote. They didn't have suffrage at the time because they didn't have any money. So they couldn't pay the tax, and they couldn't run for parliament. And this is, the kind of the origins of the organised labour parties later. But they create this association so they could talk about how they could deal with things of their own communities and have a voice in the things that mattered. Education, improving their work conditions. It wasn't like what you think about some kind of like big political trade union with, left-wing, kind of ideas. And in fact, they actually tried to root out later after the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, even when they were still having ties with places like the mines of Donbass in the 1920s, Trotskyites and, kind of Leninists and, communists. They were more focused on how to improve their own well-being, what they called the welfare. They had some welfare societies where they were kind of trying to think, and that's kind of what baristas in Starbucks want, or workers in Amazon. They're looking about their own well-being. It's not just about pay and work conditions. It's about what it means to be part of this larger entity, because you're not feeling that same kind of connection to politics, at the moment, because, you're being told by a representative, sorry, I don't represent you because you didn't vote for me. If you're not a Democrat, you're not a Republican, you're not red, you're not blue, you're not mine. And so people are saying, well, I'm in this workplace. This is kind of my collective. This is, therefore, this is where I'm going to have to try to push to make change. So, I mean, this is kind of happening here. And we have to, realize that, we've kind of gone in a way full circle back to that, kind of period of the early emergence of sort of mass labor, and, the way that that's where the political parties that we know today and, the kind of early unions came out of as well. This sort of feeling of a mass society, but where people weren't really able to get together and implement or push for change.
With unions at a small scale and a local scale, it's like every good idea on a small scale can become a bad idea on a large
scale. Yeah.
So like marriage is a beautiful thing, but at a large scale, it becomes the marriage industrial complex that tries to make money off of it, combined with the lawyers that try to make money off the divorce. It just becomes this caricature of a thing.
Exactly.
Or like Christmas and the holidays. It's like, it's just...
I don't disagree, but what I'm saying is there's people are basically looking for something here. And,
Yes.
kind of, this is why, I mean, I myself am starting to think about much more local, kind of solutions to a lot of these, kind of problems. It's, again, the teamed networked approach.